She said she saw him. She said he wore a dark coat, that he smiled and tipped his hat before leading Annie into the dark. But the constable brushed her off. No name, no address, just another drunk woman on the corner of Hanbury Street. But what if that fleeting description was the closest anyone ever got to Jack the Ripper? This story is not about the man we never caught. It's about the people who did. It was September 8th, 1888. London's East End was drowning in filled poverty and shadows that moved when you weren't looking. Hanbury Street was no exception. Its cobblestones soaked with centuries of grime, its tenement walls closing in like jaws. But even in this bleak corner of Whitechapel, a new kind of fear had taken hold, one with a name whispered only in alleys and gin-soaked confessionals: the Whitechapel Fiend. The newspapers hadn't called him Jack yet, not officially, but something feral had already begun stalking the women of the night. Something careful, something that left behind more than corpses. It left behind confusion, and that confusion begins here, with a woman who, for all intents and purposes, should have been a footnote in history. Instead, she may have been its overlooked key. Her name was Elizabeth Long, a widow, 48 years old, poor but respectable. She lived near Brick Lane and earned what little she could selling second-hand clothes. She was not a prostitute, not drunk, not looking for trouble. That morning, she had errands to run, chores that took her past 29 Hanbury Street. She remembered the time. She always remembered the time. A little before 5:30 a.m., she saw a woman talking to a man near the steps that led into the backyard. The woman leaned against the wall, tired, defeated. Her bonnet was loose, her hair falling. The man, he was talking low, calmly, almost tenderly. He was over 40, wore a dark overcoat and a brown deerstalker hat. His complexion was described as foreign, but in Whitechapel, that could have meant Jewish, Italian, Irish. It didn't matter. To the locals, foreign just meant not us. He didn't look threatening. Not that morning. Not to Elizabeth Long. She passed by. She remembered hearing the man's voice. "Will you?" And the woman, her voice was weak but clear. Yes. That was all. But it was more than anyone else would ever get. Later that morning, that same woman, Annie Chapman, was found lying on her back, butchered like livestock. Her throat slashed so deeply it nearly took her head clean off. Her intestines were draped over her shoulder like some grotesque ribbon. Her rings were gone. Her coins were still neatly placed at her feet. The scene looked almost ceremonial. The police chalked it up to a madman, a lunatic, someone possessed. But to Elizabeth Long, it looked like the man she saw had known exactly what he was doing. She told the police her story, gave her time, described the man, and she was ignored. It wasn't disbelief, necessarily. It was worse. Dismissal. They said the timing didn't fit. They said the medical examiner claimed Annie died closer to 5:20, not 5:30. Therefore, Long must be mistaken. She must have seen someone else. Someone less interesting. But let's think about that. Are we really going to trust the primitive time of death estimates of an overworked 19th century pathologist over a woman who knew what she saw? She didn't change her story. Not once. Even when the press hounded her. Even when detectives waved her off. She repeated what she heard, what she saw. And what if she was right? What if the man with the soft voice and the deerstalker hat wasn't just some passerby? What if that was him? You see, Jack the Ripper didn't vanish after each kill. He evaporated. He left no trails, no witnesses, except he did. Several, in fact, but none of them fit the narrative. Most were women. Most were poor. Most were, in the eyes of the system, expendable. But Elizabeth Long was not alone. Just days before, another woman had seen a different man with Polly Nichols. She described a shabby-looking gentleman with a mustache and a hard, working man's build. He, too, was calm, quiet, unmemorable, and after Annie Chapman, The sightings kept piling up, eyewitnesses who brushed shoulders with death itself, and lived to tell the tale, but were never believed. What makes Elizabeth Long's account so crucial, so eerily important, is its normalcy. This man wasn't a shadowy figure slipping through the fog. He wasn't wearing a cloak soaked in blood or carrying a blade the size of a saber. He was polite, well-spoken, unremarkable, and that's what made him so terrifying. Jack the Ripper didn't appear like a monster. He appeared like a man you'd pass without noticing, a man you'd trust for a moment, a man who might say, "Will you?" And Annie Chapman, like the others before her, said yes. But the story doesn't end here, because this wasn't the first time someone saw the killer, and it wouldn't be the last. Another witness would come forward, a man this time. His name was Israel Schwartz. He saw an assault take place just before another body was found. His story, too, was questioned, bent, twisted, and, in the end, ignored. But what happens when these witness accounts start lining up? What happens when a dark coat, a quiet voice, and a confident stride appear again and again and again? What if these people, dismissed, silenced, forgotten, were right all along? We've built Jack the Ripper into a ghost, a myth, a faceless symbol of evil. But what if he was always there, right in front of us? Seen, described, even smiled at, and we chose not to listen. Because the truth, the real truth, is rarely convenient, and it's never comforting. He didn't want to get involved. He'd just crossed over to Burner Street from Commercial Road when it happened. A scuffle near the entrance to a shadowy courtyard. A woman's cry. A man's shove. A second figure leaning silently in the shadows. Israel Schwartz stopped in his tracks. And in that moment, between courage and caution, he made a decision that would change everything. He ran. It was 12:45 a.m., September 30th, 1888. Schwartz had finished his shift. He was making his way home through the increasingly haunted streets of Whitechapel. The fog was low, sticky, yellow with the fumes of gas lamps and slaughterhouse runoff. The night pressed down on him like an iron hand. He turned onto Burner Street and saw the woman first. She was standing at the entrance of Dutfield's yard, an alley beside the International Working Men's Club. She had one hand on the gate. Her voice was soft but strained, arguing with a man who had cornered her against the wall. Then the man struck her. She fell, not hard, not dramatically, more like a stumble than a collapse. It was the kind of fall you see in pub fights. Quick, mean, measured, but it wasn't the fall that made Israel's stomach twist. It was the second man. He hadn't noticed him at first, but as the woman, later identified as Elizabeth Stride, hit the ground, a second figure emerged from the shadows near the club door. This one was silent, still, watching. His stance wasn't concerned or startled. He didn't approach the victim. He didn't flee. He simply turned his head and looked directly at Israel Schwartz. That was all it took. Schwartz bolted. He didn't shout. He didn't help. He didn't even look back. Because what he saw in that glance, what passed between him and the silent man, wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even surprise. It was recognition, as if the man had been waiting to be seen. And then let him go. Schwartz later told police he believed the man who struck Elizabeth wasn't the same as the one standing near the club, that there were two, and that only one of them was the killer. But the police didn't want that story. It was messy. It was inconvenient. Multiple men meant multiple witnesses, conflicting accounts, and most importantly, questions they couldn't afford to answer. So they focused on the attacker, the one who shoved Liz to the ground and shouted at Schwartz in what sounded like a foreign accent. Yiddish, perhaps, or German. A man in a peaked cap and dark clothes. The description matched dozens in the neighborhood. It led nowhere. But the second man, the one who just watched, the one who turned his head slowly and locked eyes with Schwartz, no sketch was made, no composite drawn, no manhunt issued. It's easy now to say Israel Schwartz fled out of cowardice. But that's not fair. Because what would you do if you found yourself staring down a killer? Not just any killer, a calculated one. One who stood inches from his latest victim as her blood began to spread and calmly watched you and let you go. You'd run too. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's what saved his life. Within minutes, Elizabeth Stride was dead. Her body was discovered by another man just moments later, a cart driver named Louis Deemschutz. His horse had balked at the courtyard entrance, wouldn't go forward. He dismounted, lit a match, and saw the silhouette of a woman's body. Blood oozed from her neck, still fresh, but there were no mutilations, no signature evisceration, no missing organs. Why? Because someone had interrupted him. That's the part most people forget. Stride was different. She was the only Ripper victim whose body wasn't mutilated. Her throat had been cut, yes, but that was it. Many believe the killer had been interrupted mid-act, spooked by Deemschutz's arrival with the cart and horse. But what if that's not true? What if the real interruption came minutes earlier, when Israel Schwartz saw him? It's a terrifying possibility that the man in the alley, silent watching, was deciding that if Israel had taken one step closer, if he had asked, "Are you all right?" If he had tried to help, he might have died. The killer didn't run because he didn't need to. He waited, and then he moved on, because 30 minutes later, the second body dropped. Catherine Eddowes, found in Mitre Square, mutilated beyond belief. This time, he finished what he started. Throat cut, face disfigured, kidney removed, intestines rearranged. Just as with Chapman, just as with Nichols. But this time there was more, because this time he left a clue. A piece of Catherine's apron, soaked in blood, was found in Golston Street, 5 minutes walk from Mitre Square, and above it, scrawled in chalk, was the message: "The jurors are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." It was wiped clean before dawn. Sir Charles Warren, fearing riots, ordered it removed before it could be photographed, but the message had already been received. Blame, division, and the idea that maybe, just maybe, the killer was hiding in plain sight. Now here's where it gets even darker. Schwartz's testimony was buried, shelved. Some detectives believed him, others didn't. Some said he saw the Ripper. Others claimed it was just a domestic spat. But Scotland Yard knew something wasn't right, because shortly after Schwartz's sighting, the Dear Boss letter arrived, the one that signed off, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." What if the killer knew he'd been seen? What if Jack the Ripper, realizing a witness had survived, decided to escalate the terror, not just with his blade, but with his voice? A name, a brand, a legend. Jack the Ripper wasn't born in the shadows. He was born the moment someone saw him and walked away. Israel Schwartz lived the rest of his life in silence. He didn't talk to reporters, didn't profit, didn't write memoirs. But what he saw that night, what passed between him and the man in the alley, may have been the closest anyone ever came to standing face to face with the Ripper, and still surviving. But he wasn't the last, because another man, unlike Schwartz, chose not to walk away. And in doing so, he stepped right into the Ripper's trap. They called it the double event, a phrase that sounds almost celebratory, like a performance. But the only performance that night was death, meticulously timed, disturbingly deliberate. 2 women, 2 murder scenes, less than an hour apart, and in between them, a ghost. Not a shadowy figure in a cloak, but something far more chilling. A mind that planned, a hand that calculated, a killer who evolved. When the body of Elizabeth Stride was found at 1 a.m. on September 30th, 1888, Scotland Yard dispatched every available constable into the labyrinthine alleys of Whitechapel. They assumed, hoped, that the killer had been scared off. They were wrong. At 1:45 a.m., barely 45 minutes later, a City of London policeman named Edward Watkins entered Mitre Square on his routine beat. He carried a lantern. He saw nothing unusual. But when he returned on his next pass, she was there, lying in a dark corner, twisted on the cobblestones. Her throat slit, her face sliced open, one eyelid cut, the tip of her nose removed, her abdomen slashed open and pulled apart. It was Catherine Eddowes. And this time, the killer had finished what he'd started. But how? Between the discovery of Stride and the murder of Eddowes, Whitechapel was crawling with police. Clubs had locked their doors. Prostitutes were warning each other in whispers. The neighborhood was alert. And yet, within a window of mere minutes, Jack the Ripper moved through the fog like vapor, undetected, unheard, and completely in control. This wasn't frenzy. This wasn't chaos. This was methodical. This was a man with a plan. Let's follow his path. After fleeing Dutfield's yard, he would have headed west, past Wentworth Street, down Duke's Place, and into Mitre Square. The route would take him out of Whitechapel and into the jurisdiction of the city police. A different force, slower to mobilize. It was a brilliant tactic. While the Metropolitan Police were fixated on Berner Street, the Ripper shifted borders, exploited the confusion. He chose a spot he'd likely cased before, Mitre Square. It was quiet, secluded, the perfect stage. But Catherine Eddowes wasn't supposed to be there. Hours earlier, she'd been arrested for drunkenness on Aldgate High Street. She sobered up in a jail cell at Bishopsgate. At 1 a.m., the same moment Stride's body was being discovered, she was released. She told the officer she felt better now. She turned right and vanished into the fog. Within 45 minutes, she was dead. The wounds were grotesque. Beyond the slashed throat and mutilated face, the killer had removed her kidney and womb. He'd left her intestines on display, looped over her shoulder like a grotesque sash. And then he vanished again. Or did he? Because for the first time, he left something behind. At 2:55 a.m., a constable walking down Golston Street, less than 10 minutes from the murder scene, found a bloody scrap of cloth. It matched Catherine Eddowes' apron. It had clearly been used to wipe a blade, but above it a message. The jurors are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Misspelled, scrawled in chalk. And suddenly, this wasn't just about murder. It was about misdirection. It was about inciting fear. Sir Charles Warren, head of the Metropolitan Police, arrived shortly after. He faced a terrible choice: leave the message and risk a riot, or destroy a potential clue. At dawn, the wall was scrubbed clean. No photographs were taken. The message was lost. Some say that was Jack's true victory that night. Not the blood, not the organs, but the chaos. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to divide. And still, there's something stranger. The placement of the apron wasn't random. Golston Street was a direct path from Mitre Square to Flower and Dean Street, where many of the Ripper's victims, including Eddowes, had lived. It was as if he was tracing a signature, marking his territory, mapping out his kingdom of shadows. And then, as quickly as he came, he vanished. The days that followed were filled with dread. But not just among the poor of Whitechapel. Parliament met in closed sessions. Queen Victoria wrote directly to the Home Secretary. Scotland Yard turned inward, because this wasn't just a killer. This was a scandal, a humiliation. One man, possibly 2 steps ahead of every constable and commissioner. And then came the letter. It was postmarked the day before the double event, but it arrived shortly after, written in red ink, mocking, gleeful. It ended with a chilling signature. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. The name stuck. The press ran with it. And just like that, the killer had a voice. He wasn't a phantom anymore. He was a celebrity. But what if that was his intention all along? Not just to terrorize, but to become immortal. After all, mutilation silences a victim. But a letter addressed to the press? That speaks forever. But here's where it grows cold again. Because after the double event, Jack the Ripper disappeared for over a month. No more letters. No more killings. Just silence. But silence is often the scariest sound of all, because silence means planning. And when he returned, he brought Whitechapel its most horrifying scene yet: a locked room, a rent due, and a woman mutilated beyond recognition. It was the morning of November 9th, 1888. A rent collector named Thomas Bowyer approached 13 Miller's Court, a cramped room at the back of a decaying building off Dorset Street. Mary Jane Kelly was behind on her rent, 29 shillings in arrears. Bowyer knocked. No answer. He moved the window and pulled back the thin, mildewed curtain. The glass was cracked, the edges jagged, like a wound frozen in time. He peered in. What he saw made him stumble backward and run, because inside that room, hell had opened. Mary Jane Kelly was the Ripper's final known victim. But unlike the others, she wasn't found in the street or a backyard. She was murdered in her own home, a locked, single-room hovel lit by the dull flicker of a fireplace. When authorities forced the door open with a pickaxe, they didn't just enter a crime scene. They entered a theater of desecration. Mary's body was barely human. Her face had been flayed down to the bone, her breasts cut off, her thighs slashed open, her abdominal cavity emptied, organs removed and placed neatly at her feet. Her heart was missing. No one could say if she'd been conscious when it began, but the sheer brutality of the mutilation made it clear. This killing took time, and this time, Jack hadn't been rushed. For the first time, he had privacy, 4 walls, a closed door, no patrolling constables to worry about, no footsteps to flee from. He could work, and he did, for hours. Here's what makes Mary Jane Kelly's murder more terrifying than all the others. She was not a broken woman. She was only 25 years old. Yes, she was a prostitute. Yes, she drank. But she was reportedly attractive, witty, often described as sweet-natured. She lived with a man, Joseph Barnett, until recently. They had split only weeks before. Some said she was trying to leave the life behind. She had hope. She had a mirror, a fireplace. A few modest dresses hung neatly against the wall. She was trying to start over. The timeline that night is hauntingly thin. Witnesses claimed to hear a faint cry of murder around 4 a.m., but it was ignored. Screams were common in Whitechapel. Barnett had visited her the evening before. They'd spoken, perhaps argued, but he left around 8 p.m. At 10 o'clock, Mary was seen drinking alone in the pub. By midnight, she was reportedly seen with a man. By morning, she was unrecognizable. Here's a detail that continues to haunt researchers. The door to Mary's room was locked from the inside. The only way in or out, it seemed, was the window. And yet, there were no signs of struggle. No overturned furniture. No torn sheets. No blood trails across the floor. Just a concentrated pool of gore at the center of the bed. It was almost as if she invited him in. Some say Mary knew her killer. That perhaps, unlike the others, he didn't approach her as a client, but as someone she trusted. There's a disturbing intimacy to the crime. To slice someone's face from their skull takes time, resolve, a sickening level of detachment, or worse, obsession. Her heart wasn't just missing, it was never found. The murder of Mary Kelly shook even the most hardened investigators. Veteran detectives vomited upon entering the room. Reporters were silenced, not censored, silent. There were no grotesque drawings in the papers this time. Just a single phrase whispered over and over in pubs and lodging houses. He's still out there. This was no longer the work of a man on the edge. This was a crescendo of something deeply ritualistic. He hadn't simply wanted to kill Mary Kelly. He wanted to erase her, strip her of identity, of dignity, of humanity. And he succeeded. After Kelly's death, something changed. The Ripper letters dried up. The newspapers, once gleeful with headlines, grew grim. Scotland Yard doubled its force in Whitechapel. Men who once laughed off rumors of a monster began locking their doors. Even Queen Victoria wrote in her diary about the murders in Whitechapel. A rare nod from the crown to the underworld of the East End. And then, nothing. There were other murders, other mutilations, but none like these. None with the same hallmark precision, the same eerie silence before and after, the same sense of performance. It was as though the killer had finished his work. But now, investigators were left with a new question. Not who is he, but why did he stop? Had he died? Been imprisoned? Fled? Or had he changed his face, his name, his city? Vanished into the crowd, just like he always did after each killing. One man, moving through the streets with a calm gait, blood under his nails, organs in a parcel, and a name he gave himself, now whisper across the world, Jack the Ripper. But if Mary Kelly marked the end, then who was she to him? Why her? Why indoors? Why so much worse? And here's where the cracks begin to show. Because if you trace the timeline, if you follow the last known sightings, if you look at who had access to her room and who vanished just after, you don't find a cloaked figure with a scalpel. You find a name, a man known to her, someone close, someone forgotten in the annals of suspect lists. But he would resurface, and when he did, he would carry the Ripper's legacy with him. He wasn't the first name on the suspect list, not even the 10th. But when the blood dried and the fog lifted over Miller's Court, there was one man who could not be forgotten, Joseph Barnett, Mary Jane Kelly's former lover, a fish porter by trade. Quiet, thin, mustached, lived with her for over a year, until she kicked him out 2 weeks before she was murdered. And yet, he still visited, he still cared, he still watched. Joseph first met Mary in 1887. They shared a cramped room on Dorset Street, surviving on odd jobs and the thin income Mary brought in from the streets. She told him she wanted to stop, to leave the life, to live honestly. But she didn't, not entirely. Mary had begun allowing other women to sleep in their room. Fellow prostitutes, strays, friends. Joseph hated it. Not just the company, but the danger. He was proud, jealous, in love, and angry when he moved out on October 30th. Some said it was the beginning of the end. On the night of November 8th, just hours before her death, Joseph Barnett visited Mary. They talked through the cracked wooden door. He later told police that he gave her money and left, but no one could verify his story. And strangely, his key to the room was missing. That door, the one locked from the inside, Barnett claimed Mary had lost the key days earlier, and they'd taken to reaching into the broken window to unlock it from the inside. So if the killer entered that way, he'd have to be someone who knew the window, knew the reach, knew Mary would let him in. Here's where it gets even darker. When investigators examined the contents of the room, they found a small broken mirror, blood-specked, and beneath the bed, a man's pipe. Not Mary's. Barnett smoked a pipe. He also had a knife he used at the docks. He told police he'd lost it. Detective Walter Dew, who later became famous for capturing Dr. Crippen, was a young constable in Whitechapel at the time. Years later, he would write, "I have always held the view that Barnett committed the murder, not out of madness, but out of love twisted into rage. A man pushed to the edge by poverty, jealousy, and the woman he couldn't save. He didn't want her working, didn't want her sharing their home with other women." Some believe that Joseph killed Mary as a final act of control, a desperate attempt to end her descent. And perhaps the others were just practice. Here's the theory. Barnett wanted Mary to stop working as a prostitute. He thought the murder of other sex workers would frighten her off the streets. That if he couldn't convince her with words, he'd terrify her with blood. He knew the streets. He knew the women she worked beside. He could have followed them, picked them off one by one, not because he hated them, but because he loved her. And when it didn't work, when Mary continued to walk the alleys and drink with strangers, he snapped. What makes this theory so chilling isn't just the motive, It's the timing. Mary was the last victim, the most mutilated, the most personal. After her death, the murders stopped. Completely. It's as though the killer's mission was complete. And Barnett? He remained in Whitechapel, continued working, cooperated with police, even attended Mary's inquest, standing just feet from the mortician as he described the obliteration of the woman Joseph once called his own. He wept. No charges were brought against him. Too little evidence. Too many unknowns. Barnett faded back into obscurity, eventually moving away, dying in 1926, buried in a simple grave, forgotten. But to this day, ripperologists still debate his guilt. Was he the face behind the myth? A man who watched, who warned, who wept, and then destroyed the thing he loved most? Or was he just a tragic witness to horrors no man should ever see? But if Joseph Barnett was Jack the Ripper, why did he spare Elizabeth Stride? Why did he carve out uteruses and kidneys, then stop with Mary? And more importantly, why did someone else start writing letters, using Jack's name long after Barnett disappeared? Because the story doesn't end in 1888. It just changed form, from blade to pen, from murder to myth. The knife had been sheathed. No more blood on the cobblestones. No more broken bodies in the dark. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th, 1888, the East End of London exhaled. But it was a relief that followed. It was obsession, because terror doesn't vanish. It echoes, and in Jack's absence, his name grew fangs of its own. It started with a letter, not the Dear Boss letter, not even the from hell note sent to George Lusk with half a human kidney. Those had already stirred the press and lit fires under Scotland Yard. But what came next was different. In December 1888, just a month after the last canonical killing, hundreds of letters poured into police stations and newspaper offices across London. Some were rambling, some methodical, all signed the same way, Jack the Ripper. They came from across England, Birmingham, Manchester, even Dublin, each one claiming credit for the Whitechapel murders, each one taunting the police, and each one feeding a fire that refused to die. Most of these letters were dismissed as hoaxes, forgeries by the curious, the deranged, and the desperate for attention. But a few, they were more than ink on paper. They were invitations to fear, to mimicry, and to murder. In February 1889, a woman named Alice Mackenzie was found in Castle Alley with her throat slit and abdomen slashed. The wounds were shallower. The scene lacked the ritualistic horror of Mary Kelly's death. But still the paper screamed, Jack the Ripper returns. Was it him? Or someone inspired? A man chasing infamy? A soul who found a twisted kind of purpose in the blood of strangers? Then came the whispers from America. Yes, America. In 1891, a woman named Carrie Brown, nicknamed Old Shakespeare by the New York underclass, was found dead in a squalid Manhattan hotel room. Her body was mutilated, brutally, and carved into her flesh was a symbol. The newspapers didn't hesitate. Jack the Ripper crosses the Atlantic. Investigators speculated that the killer was a British sailor, possibly someone who had known the Whitechapel victims. But no one was arrested. No one was charged. Just like in London, the Ripper had vanished into the fog. Back in England, more letters came, some wrapped in blood-soaked cloth, others accompanied by animal organs, passed off as human. There were copycats, butchers, doctors, surgeons, all suspected, all interrogated, none convicted. It wasn't just about killing anymore. It was about becoming Jack, stepping into the void he'd left behind, wearing his name like a shroud. In 1896, yet another murder in Whitechapel stoked the flames. The victim, Frances Coles, her throat slashed beneath a railway arch. A man named James Sadler, a sailor with a violent past, was arrested, but no evidence could hold him. No trial, no justice. Just another name added to the growing list of almosts and maybes. and another opportunity for the press to resurrect the ghost of Jack the Ripper. So, why did the murders keep happening? Why did men across the world, across oceans, pick up where Jack left off? It wasn't just the blood. It was the myth. Jack the Ripper had become more than a killer. He was a symbol of rage, of power, of complete, uncatchable darkness. And for some men, that was intoxicating. There was even a term whispered in elite circles behind thick drapes and gentlemen's cigars: Ripper fever. A psychological contagion, an idea so potent it infected the minds of men already standing on the edge of sanity. The theory? Jack wasn't one man, but many, a lineage of darkness passed down not by blood, but by legend, a cult of one, replicated in shadows. Even Scotland Yard began to believe that the name Jack the Ripper might no longer refer to a single hand, but to a mask, worn by anyone brave or broken enough to claim it. But here's the part that chills the bone. One of the most chilling letters sent in 1892 contained a line unlike any other. Written in untraceable ink, smeared in age, it read, "You think I stopped, but I simply changed shape. I am not gone. I am many." And it was signed, not Jack, but Legion. So we must ask, did Jack the Ripper really stop? Or did he become something else? Something anyone could invoke? A myth? A message? A mirror for the darkest part of the human soul? He was never arrested, never interrogated. He wasn't on Scotland Yard's suspect list. In fact, most never even knew his name. But his sketches, crumpled, water-stained pages found decades later in a mold-bitten attic, showed things no one should have seen. The angle of Polly Nichols' body on Buck's Row, the arch of the alleyway where Annie Chapman bled into the bricks, the exact twist of intestines tossed over his shoulder like ribbon, rendered in charcoal, shaded with grime. One image, in particular, stopped the historian cold. Mary Jane Kelly, nude, shredded, eyes wide open in terror. But the drawing was done before her murder. The signature in the bottom right corner? T. Cutbush, Thomas Cutbush. To most, he was a ghost story whispered in asylum corridors. But to a few Victorian doctors, he was a case study in madness or something darker. Born in 1866, Thomas was raised by his mother and aunt after his father died. A quiet boy, often ill, but with a fascination, an obsession with anatomy and dissection. Not unusual in post-Darwin London. Science and medicine were booming. But Thomas didn't just study the diagrams in Gray's Anatomy. He recreated them on stray cats, on dead pigeons. By the time he was 21, he'd become reclusive, erratic, stalking women in the alleys of Kennington and Lambeth, muttering under his breath about the sin of Eve and cleansing the gutters. He was committed to Lambeth Infirmary in 1891 after attempting to stab 2 women in the lower abdomen with a long blade. The newspapers called him the Mad Knife Fiend. But here's what they didn't print. The asylum physician noted that Cutbush had vivid hallucinations of blood and women with torn open bellies, that he claimed to be cleansing Whitechapel from harlots who birth plagues, that during one violent outburst he screamed, "I sent them back to the clay," just like Kelly. Now, this would have remained forgotten case, another lunatic among many. But in 1894, Sir Melville Macnaghten, Chief Constable of Scotland Yard CID, wrote a now-famous memorandum naming 3 possible suspects in the Ripper case. Thomas Cutbush was not one of them. In fact, Macnaghten went out his way to discredit the idea, writing that Cutbush was clearly mad and that no connection should be made between him and the Whitechapel murders. But why? Because the press had gotten too close. The Sun, in 1894, began running a series of explosive stories. Was Jack the Ripper an East End doctor's nephew? The paper claimed that Cutbush's uncle worked for Scotland Yard, that evidence was being suppressed to protect the family name. A cover-up. The Metropolitan Police went on a public relations offensive, discrediting the paper, the theory, and Cutbush himself. But years later, hidden in the yard's archives, a fragment of destroyed report was recovered, burned around the edges. Ink bled. One line remains legible. Cutbush sketch of Dorset Street before the deed. How did he? That's it. That's all it said. Let's rewind. In 1888, Thomas Cutbush would have been 22. He was living just south of the Thames, but frequently visited Whitechapel, claiming he was studying sin. He was obsessed with medical texts, known to keep a collection of knives in a locked chest under his bed. And according to his aunt, he once vanished for 3 nights in late September, around the time of the double event. When he returned, he was covered in what she called paint. But the smell, she said, was coppery, metallic, like blood. And then there's the sketches, found in an attic in South London in 1932, inside a chest purchased at an estate auction. The buyer was an art teacher. He recognized the date on the back of one sketch, September 8, 1888. He knew what that meant. He turned them in. Scotland Yard never released the images, but a few black and white photocopies leaked years later to an unnamed archivist. They're grainy, faded, but unmistakable. One even shows a bird's eye view of Miller's Court, with a red X where Mary Kelly's bed stood. Cutbush died in 1903, still locked in Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. His cause of death: general paralysis of the insane, likely late-stage syphilis. He was buried in an unmarked grave, forgotten, except one of the last notes in his Broadmoor file, dated a few days before his death, reads, subject more lucid today. When shown a sketch of a London street, he began to weep and whisper. She had hair like straw. I made her sleep forever. No name, no context, but Mary Jane Kelly? She had golden hair, and she died in her bed, her face slashed until unrecognizable. Just as Cutbush had drawn it. So what do we believe? Was Cutbush the Ripper? Was he a forger? An imitator? A voyeur of crime after the fact? Or was he something worse? The true killer, shielded by blood ties and buried by a police force desperate to keep its own reputation intact? We'll never know for certain. But what we do know is this. The sketches were real, the details accurate, too accurate. And in the bottom corner of each page, next to the curling ink and initials, was one final word scrawled like a child's scribble, over and over again. Cleanser. Whitechapel, 1888. A city on edge. Citizens watched the fog, not for strangers, but for someone too familiar. A man who walked openly, past checkpoints without question. A man in uniform. The police conspiracy. It sounds like fiction, too outlandish, too sensational. But a thread emerges when you look close, not at the murders, but at the men tasked with solving them. Let's begin with a name you won't find in most official reports. Constable James Kenneth Golding, born in 1856, assigned to H Division of the Metropolitan Police, Whitechapel District, described in records as quiet, methodical, and strangely precise. But then came a whisper buried in internal police memos from October 1888. Golding is to be reassigned from night patrol. No explanation. Then this. Complaints from lodging house on Hanbury Street. Unwanted return visits by patrolmen after hours. And this chilling note in a logbook. Female residents fear the man who never knocks. Golding wasn't dismissed. He wasn't demoted. He was quietly relocated to administrative duty. His beat? Right through Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, Dutfield's Yard, every site of the Canonical Five. But he never appears in any official witness accounts. No public records tie him to the investigations, except one. In a confidential inquiry commissioned in 1895, a retired inspector cited a constable with access to evidence who had been obsessively reading pathology reports and memorizing dissection notes. That constable? J.K. Golding. Now, here's where it turns darker. Golding lived in a lodging house just off Golston Street. The very location where Catherine et al.'s bloodied apron was found, alongside that infamous graffiti. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Except Golding wasn't Jewish. He wasn't Irish. He was a Protestant, born in Norwich. So why did several locals claim he spoke with a foreign accent when seen at night? Why did one woman, a laundress named Clara Whitlow, tell her priest in 1889 that a man in police garb had offered her money to pose as a corpse? She never spoke publicly. She died less than a year later of accidental poisoning. Let's return to the crime scenes. The Ripper's method? Silent, fast, unseen. Yet the murders happened just streets away from active patrols. In the middle of London. No one ever heard a scream. But what if the killer had no reason to hide? What if a woman, drunk, desperate, cold, saw a constable beckon her from a foggy alley? Would she scream? Would she run? No, she'd feel safe. She'd follow. Here's what few know. In 1892, an anonymous letter was sent to the Times newspaper. It was never published, but a copy was preserved in the police archive. It read, "I was once one of them, a boy in blue. I saw things. I cleaned blood from boots that weren't mine. They made jokes. Tidy job on Annie. They said, I left the force. I cannot forget." There was no return address, no name, but at the bottom was a smudged red fingerprint. Not blood, ink, police issue. The conspiracy deepens with a memo from Commissioner Sir Charles Warren himself, written just 2 days after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. All internal inquiries regarding suspect personnel must be sealed. No information to be shared beyond direct CID channels. That memo has no follow-up, but it's time-stamped 12 hours before Warren gave his resignation. Was it guilt? Was it pressure? Or was it a final act of burying the truth? Let's talk access. Only a constable would know which streets weren't patrolled, which courtyards were abandoned at dawn, where shadows fell at 4:30 a.m. And only a senior constable could silence subordinates with a glare and a badge. James Golding's last known assignment was clerical. He vanished in 1890. No death certificate, no record of travel, nothing. But in 1920, a man calling himself John Kay. Graham died in a sanitarium outside Bristol. He left behind a box of sketches, surgical knives, and pages of rambling verse. One stood out. It read, "You watched the night to protect. I watched it to perfect. Yours were rules. Mine are right. You chase ghosts. I kiss fright. The beat goes on, but I no longer walk it." Written beneath it, Whitechapel, 1888. The handwriting matched to the original police logbook entries of Constable James Kenneth Golding. So, was the Ripper a man of the law? A protector turned predator? Was there a cover-up? Or worse, a silent brotherhood, shielding one of their own from scandal? We'll never get full answers. But when you trace the shadows cast by the fog and the men allowed to walk in it, one thing becomes clear. The Ripper didn't need to hide. He was the system, and systems protect themselves. They called her the Angel of Mercy. She walked among the dying with calm hands and quiet steps. She wore white. She carried tools. But behind the veil of Victorian virtue lurks something far colder than madness. The woman no one suspected, Bell Yard, nestled near Fleet Street, was not part of the Ripper's known hunting grounds. It was cleaner, wealthier, a world apart from Whitechapel's rotting gutters. But Bell Yard held a secret. It was a location of London Hospital's female surgical ward, and its chief nurse in 1888 was Miss Margaret Rowena Clark. Her record? Impeccable. Trained under Florence Nightingale's School of Nursing. Praised for her precision with a scalpel. Noted for an unusual calm in the presence of extreme trauma. But quietly, some staff whisper of oddities. She dissected with military discipline, far beyond the need for nursing. She stayed late, sometimes sleeping in the basement mortuary. She volunteered for autopsy assistance, even when not required. And there's this. In late August 1888, She took 3 weeks unexplained leave, the same period that encompassed the deaths of Martha Tabram, Polly Nichols, and Annie Chapman. Now let's look closer. Clark had grown up the daughter of a country surgeon, a man who believed medicine should be restricted to men. She watched him dissect animals at the age of 6. She was said to have memorized Gray's Anatomy by 11. When she arrived in London, she carried only a satchel. Inside it, according to one roommate, were a leather roll of surgical blades, a worn copy of the Anatomia Corporis Homini, and a single jar containing something pickled. The roommate never asked what it was. She moved out 2 days later. Unusual movements. On the night of September 29th, the day before the double murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, a woman matching Clark's description was seen exiting Mitre Square just minutes before P.C. Watkins arrived. Witnesses noted her odd composure and a small case tucked beneath her cloak. The description never made the newspapers. Why? Because it didn't fit the image of a killer. A woman in her 30s in nursing garb? The police dismissed it. But there's more. Following the horrific mutilation of Mary Jane Kelly, a single blood-stained cloth was discovered near Spitalfields. It bore the faint imprint of an embroidered C. The cloth vanished before it was officially logged. Why Clark? Let's talk MO. The Ripper didn't just kill. He removed specific organs, the uterus, kidneys, bladder, with surgical accuracy. Multiple pathologists at the time claimed the incision suggests knowledge of the body not found in common butchers or laymen. But what about a nurse, trained not only to cut, but to cut cleanly, quickly, quietly? Clark would have had access to surgical tools, anatomical specimens, rooms full of unchallenged solitude at night, and most chillingly, she would have been invisible to men, to police, to everyone. In 1890, she was institutionalized. The records cite hysterical melancholia after an attempted suicide. She spoke in tongues. She tore apart a pigeon during her intake. She drew the Mitre Square crime scene in charcoal on the walls of her room. She was committed to Bethlehem Hospital, Bedlam, where she lived out her days in silence. Her final statement before confinement: "They always looked up at me, even when they shouldn't have had eyes left." Buried files. In 1983, historian Jennifer Lee uncovered fragments of a suppressed case file. The file, titled Operation Moonlight, included a memo written in 1889. Female suspect not feasible. Press must not speculate. Vulnerability of gender image. The handwriting belongs to Inspector Frederick Aberline. Yes, that Aberline. The man in charge of the Ripper investigation. Even he had considered it. But he knew the truth wouldn't be tolerated. That a woman, a nurse, no less, could be Jack the Ripper? It would have shattered Victorian England's fragile illusion of feminine virtue. So the possibility was quietly buried, along with every trace of Margaret Clark's involvement. But look again at the evidence. Medical precision, the anatomical consistency, the ability to move unnoticed, the surgical knowledge hidden behind a benevolent role. Perhaps Jack the Ripper wasn't a butcher, a foreigner, or a mad aristocrat. Perhaps he was a she, an angel in white, whose mask never slipped, until it did. And when it did, London bled. There's one thing the case of Jack the Ripper has never lacked: theories, books, letters, diaries, even hoaxes. But what if the greatest clue of all wasn't found in any letter, any suspect, or even any witness account, but hidden within the victims themselves? The geometry of murder. In 1975, a former Scotland Yard consultant named Alan Gorse revisited the 5 canonical murders with a different lens. He wasn't a detective. He was a cartographer. His job? Mapping ancient lines beneath London. Ley lines, trade routes, buried architecture. He plotted the exact GPS points of the 5 canonical victims, and one anomaly: Martha Tabram. What he found shocked him. A perfect pentagram. Not just a crude shape, but but a mathematically aligned five-pointed star, with each murder at or near a key intersection. What lay at the center of that star? A ruined 12th century priory buried beneath what is now Christchurch Spitalfields, one of the oldest ecclesiastical structures in London, once used by secret societies and surgeons for anatomical dissections, and according to obscure archival reports, even ritual gatherings. Gorse's theory? The Ripper murders were not random. They were a form of message, ritualistic, mathematical, and perhaps even spiritual. A signature hidden in flesh. Each victim suffered mutilation, but few have asked why those organs were chosen. Polly Nichols, uterus removed. Annie Chapman, uterus and part of the bladder. Catherine Eddowes, left kidney, uterus. Mary Jane Kelly, almost entirely disassembled. What do these organs share? They're reproductive, symbolic of creation. If the killings were an act of reversal, then each murder was a decreation, a perversion of birth, a ritualistic unmaking of womanhood. This aligns with an obscure passage in Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century witch hunting manual. He who wounds the womb unbinds the soul from the feminine gate. Strange coincidence? Perhaps. But the surgical precision, the symbolism, and the ritualistic timing between killings, particularly the double event, suggests something more than rage. It suggests design. The Last Cipher. In 2017, while restoring records at the London Hospital Archives, a preservationist named Eleanor Keats uncovered a forgotten logbook from 1888. It detailed night staff rotations, specifically for Belliard's morgue. On the date of Mary Jane Kelly's murder, one entry stood out. M. Clark present, unscheduled, claimed she was preparing for dissection of unclaimed woman. No such corpse recorded. Why is that significant? Because Mary Kelly was not taken directly to the hospital. She was examined at the scene and then buried. No dissection was ever authorized. So who was the unclaimed woman Clark mentioned? Was it Mary? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone Clark had prepared and dissected in secret? So, who was Jack the Ripper? A butcher? A doctor? A royal? A madman? Or a woman hidden beneath the safety of uniform? Maybe Jack the Ripper was all of them. Or maybe he was none of them. Because perhaps Jack the Ripper wasn't a person, but a pattern, a dark ritual, replicated by different hands, under the same shadow, a movement cloaked by fog, gin, and Victorian shame, one that used the chaos of Whitechapel as cover, that knew how to choose victims no one would fight for, and when the pentagram was complete, when the pattern was fulfilled, the killing stopped, the silence that followed, no arrest, no trial, no confession, just silence, and in that silence, Jack the Ripper lived on, not as a man, not even as a killer, but as a myth, a mirror, a story that outlived the empire that gave it birth. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all. We were never meant to solve it. We were only ever meant to look, to stare into the darkness, and see ourselves. Before you go, if this story pulled you in, if it chilled your spine and made you question what really lurks in the pages of history, subscribe now to never miss another case like this. I uncover the shadows others skip, the stories history tried to bury, and the secrets hiding in plain sight. So hit that bell, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one where the truth, maybe even darker,